It was an ordinary afternoon in a small town where everyone knew each other by sight, if not by name. People went about their day with easy familiarity, pausing to wave or chat over picket fences. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen until this day, when the simple peace of the town would be shattered in a way no one saw coming. At the neighborhood park, families were gathered. Kids ran around, chasing each other, shrieking with laughter as parents watched from nearby benches. Among them was a teenager, 17 years old, tall and lean with a friendly smile and an air of quiet confidence. He was the kind of young man people spoke highly of, known for his kindness and willingness to help anyone who needed it, whether it was a friend struggling with homework or a neighbor looking for an extra hand. Today, he was enjoying a rare moment of peace, sitting by himself on the grass, scrolling through his phone and tuning out the lively noise around him. Not far from him, a little girl named Emily, about 5 years old with bouncing blonde curls and endless energy, was playing close to the water's edge. Her mother, deep in conversation with a friend on a nearby bench, kept a watchful eye, occasionally calling out to remind Emily to stay close. Emily, like many kids her age, had a fearless streak and an insatiable curiosity. She loved to wander just close enough to the water's edge to make her heart race with the thrill of stepping into the unknown. In a split second, that thrill turned to something else entirely. One moment, Emily was tossing pebbles into the lake, her giggles filling the air. The next, she slipped, her tiny feet losing their grip on the muddy ground beneath her. A gasp escaped her lips as she fell forward, her arms flailing, reaching for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. Her mother's head snapped up, her conversation instantly forgotten, her face turning from relaxed to horrified as she saw her little girl disappear into the water. The teenager, who had been sitting quietly, looked up at the sound of her scream, instincts kicking in before his mind could even process what was happening. In an instant, he was on his feet, heart pounding as he sprinted toward the water's edge, pushing past other onlookers who had frozen in shock. Without a second thought, he dove into the lake, the cold water closing over him as he scanned the murky depths for any sign of the little girl. As he searched desperately, his mind raced. Would he be able to find her in time? Would he even be able to reach her before it was too late? But just when he felt his strength beginning to falter, his hand brushed against something soft, a tiny, motionless form just beneath the surface. He grasped her, pulling her close as he kicked upward with all his might, his lungs burning as he fought his way back to the surface. And as they broke through into the air, a wave of relief washed over him, even as he heard the gasps of onlookers who had gathered, watching with bated breath. Holding the little girl tightly, he swam toward the shore, where a crowd was now waiting, stunned by what they had just witnessed. But the question on everyone's mind was the same: would he make it in time? Would this brave act, this selfless leap into the unknown, be enough to save her? As he finally reached the shore, the girl's mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her daughter, her voice trembling with hope and fear. And the teenager, barely catching his breath, handed her over, his face filled with a quiet determination that spoke louder than any words ever could. But as the onlookers watched, one question hung heavy in the air: what would happen next? And in that moment, no one knew the answer, but they knew they had just witnessed something remarkable, something that would restore their faith in what people could do for one another. As the teenager pulled Emily from the water and gently handed her to her mother, the entire crowd that had gathered seemed to collectively exhale, as though they'd been holding their breath the whole time. Her mother, shaken and grateful beyond words, wrapped Emily in her arms, her face pale but filled with relief. Emily was conscious, but her breaths were shallow, and her eyes were only half open. She had taken in quite a bit of water, and every second mattered. People murmured around them, some in awe of what they had just seen and others already pulling out their phones to call for help. The teenager, though soaked and trembling from the chill of the lake, stayed close by, his eyes fixed on Emily, his face creased with worry. He could see she wasn't quite out of danger yet, and without a second thought he knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her back as her mother tried to comfort her. "Emily, stay with us," he whispered, his voice calm but urgent. "Keep your eyes open, okay?" A woman in the crowd stepped forward. "I know first aid," she said quickly, dropping down beside them and helping Emily's mother to encourage her to breathe deeply. Together, they gently helped Emily into a sitting position, patting her back to help her expel the water. Little by little, Emily's breathing steadied, her face regaining a bit of its natural color. Her mother's hand shook as she held her daughter close, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You saved her," she said, looking up at the teenager, gratitude filling her eyes. Thank you so much. I don't know what we would have done without you." He offered her a small, humble smile, but before he could respond, there was a sudden burst of applause from the people who had gathered around. The whole park seemed to come alive with appreciation, strangers moved by the courage they'd just witnessed. Parents hugged their own children a little tighter, deeply aware of the bravery it had taken to act so quickly in such a terrifying moment. Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. The crowd parted to let the ambulance through, and within moments, paramedics were beside Emily, checking her over with calm, efficient movements. They confirmed she was okay, but she needed to be taken to the hospital for a more thorough checkup. As the paramedics prepared to lift Emily onto a stretcher, her mother reached out, catching the teenager's hand in both of hers. "Please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Come with us to the hospital. I want you to be there." He nodded, surprised but honored, and without hesitation, climbed into the ambulance beside her. The ride was silent, aside from the occasional beeping of medical equipment, and the quiet reassurances Emily's mother whispered as she held her daughter's hand. The teenager sat by, watching Emily's tiny chest rise and fall, grateful that his quick actions had given her this chance to recover. When they reached the hospital, a doctor took Emily into the ER to run a few more tests, leaving the teenager and Emily's mother in the waiting room. They sat in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the events of the day. Finally, the mother looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something curious, almost as if she recognized him but couldn't place where from. "What's your name?" she asked gently, realizing that in the chaos of the moment, she hadn't even thought to ask. He told her his name, a soft smile on his face as he shook her hand. She held his gaze for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, and then a look of realization crossed her face. "Oh my goodness," she murmured, her hand flying to her mouth. "I know you. I know who you are." He looked at her confused, but then recognition dawned on him, too. Years ago, their families had crossed paths briefly, but in a way that left an impact either of them had forgotten. She was a family friend from his early childhood, someone he hadn't seen in years. Their worlds had moved apart, separated by life's twists and turns, but here they were, brought together in the most unexpected way. The realization washed over them, and they shared a look filled with bittersweet memories and a mutual understanding that this moment was bigger than either of them. Just then, the doctor returned, announcing that Emily was stable and would make a full recovery. Relief filled the room, and Emily's mother hugged her daughter tightly, tears in her eyes as she held on to her with newfound appreciation. She turned to the teenager, her voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You've given us a gift I could never repay." He just smiled, shaking his head. "I'm glad I was there," he replied simply. "That's all that matters." Over the next few days, word of the rescue spread throughout the town, and soon, the story reached the local news. Reporters called, eager to interview the teenager, to turn him into a local hero. But he wasn't interested in fame or recognition, he only wanted life to go back to normal. Still, the story resonated with people, spreading far beyond the town. Strangers sent letters, thanking him for his bravery and for reminding everyone of the goodness people are capable of, regardless of race, age, or background. But in a twist of fate, just as the teenager's life was starting to return to normal, something unexpected happened. One evening, he received a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with Emily's father, a man he had heard about but never met. There was an intensity in the man's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something else, an almost desperate sincerity. Emily's father extended his hand, and the teenager shook it, feeling strength of the grip, the quiet appreciation that words couldn't express. "You saved my daughter," Emily's father said, his voice barely containing emotion behind it. "And I don't know how I'll ever be able to thank you for that. But I need you to know that moment changed more than you realize." The teenager looked at him, curious, and Emily's father continued. He spoke of how he'd always carried certain assumptions, certain beliefs that had, over time, affected how he saw the world. But seeing his daughter's life saved by a stranger, by someone he'd never even met, had shattered those old beliefs, showing him the flaws and the divisions he'd once allowed to cloud his view. In that single act of bravery, he'd been given the chance to look at things differently, to see past the surface, past the things that divide, and into the heart of what truly matters. "Thank you," he repeated, his voice breaking. "You didn't just save Emily's life. You reminded me what it means to believe in people, to believe that we're all in this together. That's a gift I can't repay." The teenager nodded, deeply moved by the man's honesty. As they stood there, in that quiet moment, they both realized that something extraordinary had taken place, not just in the rescue itself but in the way it had opened hearts, challenging them to let go of judgments, and to see the common threads that connected them all. The two parted ways, with Emily's father promising that he would never forget this day and vowing to pay forward the kindness he'd witnessed. And though the teenager returned to his life, his quiet strength continued to resonate within the community, reminding everyone of the courage it takes to bridge divides and see the humanity in one another. In the end, it wasn't the act of bravery alone that left an impact, it was the ripple effect, the way one selfless act inspired others to look beyond their differences and to believe, once again, in the good that lies within each of us. After that day, life in the small town quietly returned to normal. The initial excitement and attention around the rescue faded, but the impact of the event lingered, like an invisible thread connecting people in a way that hadn't been there before. While the teenager went back to his studies and regular routine, those who had witnessed his bravery carried with them a renewed sense of connection and respect for one another, a reminder of what can happen when people look out for each other, regardless of background or appearance. Emily's family found themselves reflecting on what had happened with a mix of gratitude and humility. Her father, especially, felt a profound change within him, as if he'd been given a second chance to live with a more open heart. He made an effort to give back, taking his experience as a lesson, one that he wanted to pass on not just to his family, but to his community as well. He started volunteering more, getting involved with local youth programs, and supporting causes that fostered understanding and unity. Quietly, he became one of the teenagers' biggest advocates, ensuring that others knew how one act of bravery could make a world of difference. As for Emily, she quickly recovered from her brush with danger, but she, too, carried the memory of that day. Although she was young, she understood, in her own way, the gift of kindness and courage that had been given to her. Her mother would often remind her of the teenager's bravery, encouraging Emily to be brave and compassionate, to stand up for others just as he had done for her. And as she grew, that reminder became part of her character, shaping the kind of person she wanted to be. Over time, the teenager's life moved forward as well. Though he never sought out recognition, people in the community would often greet him warmly, some stopping to shake his hand, others simply nodding with admiration. Each time, he would respond with a humble smile, grateful that he had been able to make a difference, however small it might have seemed to him at the time. He found purpose in knowing that he had done what was right, that he had followed his instincts to help, and that it had meant so much to so many people. One evening, as he was walking home from school, he saw Emily and her family at the park, enjoying a quiet picnic under the warm glow of the setting sun. They spotted him too, and Emily's mother waved, calling him over. He walked up, and Emily, her eyes bright with excitement, handed him a small drawing she had made of the lake, with a figure in the water helping another. It was her way of saying thank you, and as he accepted it, he couldn't help but smile at the simplicity of her gesture. Her father approached him, looking him in the eye with the same gratitude and respect he had shown since that day. "I can't thank you enough," he said once more, his voice filled with sincerity. "You changed everything for us. And we'll never forget it." The teenager nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He realized that he hadn't just saved a life, he'd become part of this family's story, part of their journey, and in some way, they had become part of his too. As they stood together, he felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet assurance that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can have the biggest impacts, reaching far beyond what we might expect. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the park as they said their goodbyes. Walking home, he found himself reflecting on the events of the past few weeks, on the way his life had subtly shifted and taken on new meaning. He realized that in a world often divided by misunderstandings and fear, sometimes all it takes is a single moment of kindness to bridge the gaps between people, to remind everyone of the humanity they share. And so, life carried on. The story of that summer day at the lake became something of a local legend, a tale parents would tell their children about a brave teenager who'd seen someone in need and hadn't hesitated to act. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that courage and compassion come in all forms, and that sometimes, it's the unplanned, unassuming moments that leave the biggest impact. In the years that followed, the teenager went on to accomplish many things. He finished school, pursued his dreams, and continued to live with the same integrity and kindness he had shown on that day by the lake. And while life took him to new places and new experiences, he carried with him the memory of that afternoon, the people he had met, and the simple but powerful truth he had come to understand, that sometimes, when we act with an open heart, we create ripples that extend further than we could ever imagine. As for Emily, she grew up with that same story in her heart, carrying forward the lesson of kindness and bravery. In her own quiet way, she became someone who reached out to others, who stood up for what was right, inspired by the hero who had been there for her when she needed it most. And in this way, the impact of that one summer day continued to echo, a reminder that true heroism isn't about recognition or reward but about being there for each other, about believing in the good that binds us all together. The teenager would often look back on that day, not as a singular moment, but as a small part of a much larger journey, a journey of connection, compassion, and the realization that no act of kindness, however small, is ever truly forgotten. In the end, it wasn't just a story of rescue, it was a story of how, in reaching out to help someone else, we often find the best parts of ourselves.